Welcome, Keeper of Shadows, to the darkest tale ever whispered in the halls of Gotham, where nightmares take physical form and heroes become the very monsters they once fought against. Tonight, we shall traverse the twisted pathways of a reality where laughter echoes with malevolence, where the greatest protector became the ultimate destroyer, and where the thin line between salvation and damnation was crossed by a single terrible choice. Close your eyes, guardian of restless dreams, and let the crimson glow of a corrupted cowl guide you through this chronicle of how hope itself can be weaponized into despair. In the rain-soaked streets of Gotham City, where shadows dance with secrets and every alley whispers tales of violence postponed but never truly prevented, there exists a moment when even the most prepared mind encounters something so fundamentally disturbing that all previous understanding crumbles like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Such was the nature of the discovery that would forever alter Bruce Wayne's perception of what his life might have been, what choices truly meant, and how thin the membrane was between salvation and damnation in the cosmic tapestry of infinite possibilities. The night had begun as so many others, with Batman pursuing what appeared to be a routine smuggling operation through the industrial sectors of Gotham, where massive transport trucks moved beneath the cover of darkness carrying cargo that legitimate businesses would never dare to handle. These were the kind of criminals who thought themselves clever, who believed that their schemes were too sophisticated for detection, who had convinced themselves that moving contraband in vehicles designed for relocating entire houses would somehow escape the notice of someone who had dedicated his life to understanding every form of deception that human ingenuity could devise. The chase itself had been almost disappointingly simple, a straightforward pursuit across rain-slicked highways, where Batman's superior technology and intimate knowledge of Gotham's layout gave him every advantage over criminals, whose only real skill lay in their willingness to endanger innocent lives in their desperation to escape justice. The smugglers had pushed civilian vehicles off the road, had driven with reckless abandon through residential neighborhoods, had shown the kind of callous disregard for human life that made Batman's jaw clench with barely contained fury, even as he worked to minimize the collateral damage their panic was creating. Yet when the chase reached its inevitable conclusion, when the massive transport truck lay disabled and its occupants subdued, when Batman began his methodical examination of the cargo hold that had motivated this entire elaborate operation, what he discovered defied every assumption he had made about the nature of the crime he was investigating. The stasis pod hidden within the truck's concealed compartment was a marvel of technology that belonged more to science fiction than to any criminal enterprise he had previously encountered. Yet, it was not the sophisticated preservation system that captured his attention, but rather its contents. The body within the pod was unmistakably Bruce Wayne, identical in every measurable way to the man who stood examining it, yet different in ways that spoke to fundamental alterations in the trajectory of existence itself. This was not some elaborate hoax or criminal deception, not some attempt to create confusion through plastic surgery or genetic manipulation, but rather something far more profound and far more disturbing. The DNA analysis that Alfred conducted through the cave's sophisticated laboratory equipment confirmed what Batman's trained eye had already recognized. This was indeed Bruce Wayne, perfect in every genetic marker, identical in every biological signature, yet clearly not from any reality that the Dark Knight had ever known. The differences, when catalogued systematically, painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and revelatory in its implications for understanding what Bruce Wayne had sacrificed in his relentless pursuit of justice. Where the living Bruce bore the accumulated scars of decades of brutal conflict, evidence of bones broken and flesh torn in service of protecting others. This alternate version showed only selective scarring, the marks of someone who had fought but had known when to stop, who had understood the difference between necessary sacrifice and pointless martyrdom. The wedding ring indentation on the corpse's finger spoke to choices that the living Bruce had never allowed himself to make. Relationships that had been abandoned in favor of the endless war against crime, connections to other human beings that had been severed in the name of maintaining the psychological distance necessary for effective vigilantism. The tattoo, barely visible beneath the pale skin, bore a name that made Bruce's heart constrict with recognition and longing. Helena, the name he had once whispered to Selina Kyle in moments of unguarded intimacy. The name they had agreed upon for the daughter they would never have. Because Bruce Wayne could not risk the vulnerability that fatherhood would require. Most telling of all were the laugh lines etched around this alternate Bruce's eyes and mouth. Evidence of a life that had included genuine joy, spontaneous laughter, moments of pure happiness that existed independent of any victory over criminal forces or successful protection of innocent lives. These were the marks of someone who had learned to find meaning in simple pleasures, who had discovered that heroism could coexist with personal fulfillment, who had somehow managed to maintain his humanity while still serving the cause of justice. The medical examination revealed that this Bruce Wayne had indeed suffered the same catastrophic spinal injury that had temporarily ended the original Bruce's career as Batman, the brutal breaking administered by the monster known as Bane, in his systematic campaign to destroy everything that the Dark Knight represented. Yet where the living Bruce had fought through agony and determination to return to his role as Gotham's protector, this alternate version had made a different choice, had accepted the limitations imposed by his injury, and had found other ways to serve the city he loved. Alfred's analysis of the corpse's muscle development and bone density suggested a man who had remained active but had not subjected his body to the relentless punishment that characterized Batman's nocturnal activities. This Bruce had exercised and maintained his health, had kept himself in excellent physical condition, but had not transformed his body into the living weapon that crime fighting required. He had chosen healing over vengeance, recovery over the endless cycle of violence that defined the war against crime. The realization that slowly dawned upon Batman as he studied this alternate version of himself was both liberating and crushing in its implications. Here was proof that another path had been possible, that the choices which had shaped his existence were not inevitable consequences of his parents' murder, but rather decisions made by a conscious mind that could have chosen differently. This other Bruce had somehow found a way to honor Thomas and Martha Wayne's memory without sacrificing every possibility of personal happiness, had discovered methods of serving justice that did not require the complete abnegation of individual desires and human connections. Yet this revelation came wrapped in the darker implications of how this alternate Bruce had died, for the precision of his murder suggested an intelligence that understood exactly what kind of psychological warfare such a discovery would represent. This was not random violence or cosmic accident, but rather a deliberate message, a carefully crafted demonstration designed to show Bruce Wayne exactly what he had given up in his pursuit of the Batman identity. Someone with intimate knowledge of his psychology had arranged for him to discover this corpse, had wanted him to see the life he might have lived, the choices he might have made, the happiness he might have known. The various pieces of evidence found with the body painted a picture of a Bruce Wayne who had used his wealth and intelligence to effect change through legal and social channels, who had worked within existing systems rather than operating outside them, who had found ways to combat injustice that did not require donning a costume and prowling through shadows. This Bruce had been mayor of Gotham City, had transformed urban planning and social services, had attacked the root causes of crime rather than merely fighting its symptoms. There were photographs among his personal effects showing a life rich with relationships and shared experiences, images of gatherings with friends who appeared to genuinely enjoy his company rather than merely tolerating his presence for business reasons. These were not the carefully managed social interactions that characterized Bruce Wayne's public persona, but rather authentic moments of connection with people who knew him as more than a symbol or a financial resource. The letters found in his possession revealed correspondence with Selina Kyle that spoke of deep affection and mutual respect, a relationship that had been allowed to develop naturally rather than being constantly interrupted by the demands of vigilante activities. Their love had been permitted to grow and flourish, had been nurtured rather than sacrificed on the altar of Gotham's endless need for protection. They had built a life together that included both individual fulfillment and shared purpose, had found ways to serve justice that enhanced rather than destroyed their personal happiness. As Batman absorbed the implications of this discovery, as he processed the evidence of what his life might have been, if different choices had been made at crucial moments, he found himself confronting questions that he had always avoided, truths that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. The relentless pursuit of justice that had defined his existence had indeed prevented countless crimes and saved innumerable lives, but it had also extracted a price that perhaps had not been necessary, had demanded sacrifices that might have been avoided through different approaches to the same fundamental problems. The alternate Bruce Wayne represented not weakness or failure, but rather a different kind of strength, the courage to choose healing over hatred, growth over stagnation, hope over the grim determination that had characterized Batman's approach to crime fighting. This other version had somehow found ways to honor his parents' memory that did not require the complete sublimation of his own needs and desires, had discovered forms of service that enhanced rather than diminished his humanity. Yet even as these revelations unfolded, even as Bruce contemplated the implications of paths not taken and choices unmade, he remained acutely aware that this discovery was not accidental, that forces were at work which understood exactly how such a revelation would affect him. The psychological precision of the attack, the careful selection of evidence designed to maximize emotional impact, spoke to an intelligence that knew him intimately, that understood his vulnerabilities and regrets with the same thoroughness that he understood the criminal mind. The corpse before him was not merely evidence of alternate possibilities, but also a weapon wielded by someone who sought to undermine his confidence in the choices that had shaped his life. The message was clear and devastating in its simplicity. Everything he had sacrificed, every relationship he had abandoned, every moment of potential happiness he had rejected, had been unnecessary. Another way had been possible, a path that could have served justice while preserving humanity, and he had been too blind or too stubborn to see it. As Alfred concluded his examination and prepared to preserve the evidence that might provide clues to their unknown enemy's identity, Bruce found himself staring at this alternate version of his face, this mirror of what he might have become, this proof that heroism did not require the complete abandonment of personal fulfillment. The laugh lines around the eyes seemed to mock his own grim countenance, the peaceful expression on the corpse's face standing in stark contrast to the perpetual tension that characterized his own features. The discovery of this alternate Bruce Wayne marked the beginning of a confrontation that would test every assumption about justice, sacrifice, and the nature of heroism itself. For in showing him what he might have been, in demonstrating that other paths had been possible, this unknown enemy had struck at the very foundations of Batman's identity, had forced him to question whether his entire life's work had been built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of what service to justice actually required. in the realm beyond the veil of conventional reality, where nightmares take tangible form and the darkest possibilities of existence manifest as living threats to all that we hold sacred. There exists a dimension that serves as the shadow reflection of every universe that has ever been or ever could be. This is the dark multiverse, a cosmic aberration that stands in opposition to the natural order of creation, a place where hope withers into despair, where heroes become monsters, and where every story that should end in triumph instead concludes in tragedy so profound that it poisons the very fabric of existence itself. The dark multiverse operates according to principles that invert the fundamental laws that govern normal reality, creating conditions where entropy triumphs over order, where destruction becomes more powerful than creation, and where the worst possible outcomes of every choice and circumstance are not merely likely but inevitable. This is not simply a place of evil, for evil suggests conscious choice and moral agency, but rather a realm where the very concept of goodness is systematically corrupted and transformed into its opposite through processes so fundamental that they operate below the level of conscious thought or deliberate action. From this realm of inverted possibility emerged entities that defied every assumption about the nature of heroism and villainy, beings that had once been champions of justice in their own realities but had been transformed by circumstances so specific and so catastrophic that they became living embodiments of everything they had once opposed. These were not fallen heroes in any traditional sense, for their corruption had not come through moral weakness or gradual compromise, but rather through cosmic forces that had rewritten the very foundations of their existence. Chief among these dark reflections stood a figure that challenged every comfortable assumption about the relationship between good and evil, a being that had retained all the intelligence, determination, and tactical brilliance of Batman, while being fundamentally transformed by an experience so traumatic that it had inverted his entire moral framework. This was the Batman who laughs, a creature that embodied the terrifying possibility that heroism itself could be weaponized into its opposite, that the very qualities that made someone a protector could, under the right circumstances, make them the ultimate destroyer. The origin of this cosmic horror lay not in any single moment of moral failure or catastrophic defeat, but rather in the intersection of Batman's greatest victory with the Joker's most perfect revenge. In a reality that had unfolded almost identically to our own, where Bruce Wayne had followed the same path of training and dedication that had created the Dark Knight we knew, the eternal conflict between order and chaos had reached its ultimate conclusion when Batman finally did what he had sworn never to do and killed the Joker in what appeared to be a moment of justified necessity. Yet the Joker, in his final moments of life, had achieved something far more devastating than any of his previous schemes, for he had prepared for this possibility with a contingency plan so diabolical that it transformed his death from defeat into victory. The toxin that coursed through his cardiovascular system was not merely another variant of the chemical compounds he had used to drive others insane, but rather a perfect distillation of his essential nature, a concentrated essence of chaos and malevolence that would be released upon his death to infect whoever had killed him. The transformation that followed was neither gradual nor merciful, as the toxin rewrote Bruce Wayne's neural pathways at the cellular level, preserving his memories, his intelligence, and his tactical abilities, while fundamentally altering the moral framework that had guided their application. Where once Batman had been driven by a desire to protect the innocent and prevent others from experiencing the trauma that had shaped his life, the Batman who laughs was motivated by a twisted form of the same impulse, believing that the only way to truly end suffering was to eliminate the capacity for hope itself. The first victims of this transformation were those closest to him, the members of the Bat family, who had gathered for what they believed would be a celebration of their mentor's greatest victory over his most persistent enemy. The tea party that the newly transformed Batman Who Laughs had arranged was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty, as he had invited his adopted children and closest allies to share in what they assumed would be a moment of triumph, only to reveal that the celebration itself was their execution. The methodical elimination of Dick Grayson, Tim Drake, Jason Todd, and Damian Wayne was conducted with the same precision and tactical brilliance that Batman had always applied to his crime-fighting activities. Yet, now these skills were employed in service of a vision so fundamentally corrupted that each death served to reinforce the killer's conviction that he was performing a necessary mercy. In his transformed perception, he was not murdering his family, but rather freeing them from the burden of hope in a universe that was fundamentally hostile to happiness and meaning. The conquest that followed encompassed not merely Gotham City, but the entire Earth of his dimension, as the Batman Who Laughs systematically eliminated every hero and villain, every force for order or chaos, until he stood alone as the supreme authority over a world that had been reduced to perfect, lifeless order. The Justice League fell before his assault, not through superior power, but through superior knowledge, as he understood their weaknesses and limitations with the same intimacy that he had once applied to protecting them. Superman, the last son of Krypton, whose moral certainty had often served as a counterbalance to Batman's pragmatic approach to justice, discovered that his greatest weakness was not kryptonite or magic, but rather his inability to conceive of a version of his closest ally that would exploit their friendship as a weapon. Wonder Woman's warrior ethos proved inadequate against an opponent who fought without honor or restraint, while the Flash's speed became irrelevant when facing someone who could predict his every move through intimate knowledge of heroic psychology. The cosmic scope of the Batman Who Laughs' threat became apparent when his conquest expanded beyond the boundaries of his own reality to encompass entire sectors of the dark multiverse, as he gathered around himself other dark reflections of familiar heroes, beings who had been transformed by their own specific tragedies into instruments of universal destruction. These were not mere allies, but rather extensions of his will, creatures who shared his fundamental understanding that existence itself was a problem that required a final solution. Among these twisted reflections was the Grim Knight, a version of Batman who had chosen a different path in the moments following his parents' murder, picking up the gun that Joe Chill had dropped and using it to begin a campaign of vengeance that had never ended. Where the Batman Who Laughs represented the corruption of heroism through external transformation, the Grim Knight embodied the alternative timeline where Bruce Wayne had simply chosen differently from the beginning, embracing lethal force as his primary tool and building a criminal empire based on the principle that might makes right. The arrival of these entities in our dimension represented more than a simple invasion or conquest attempt, for their very presence challenged the fundamental stability of reality itself. The dark multiverse was not meant to maintain permanent existence. Its realities were supposed to collapse back into the void after serving their purpose as cosmic nightmares. Yet the Batman Who Laughs had found ways to anchor himself and his followers in stable reality, creating paradoxes that threatened to unravel the delicate balance that separated existence from non-existence. The methodology employed by the Batman Who Laughs in his dimensional incursion was characterized by the same careful planning and attention to detail that had made Batman such an effective crime fighter. Yet now these skills were applied to the systematic destruction of everything that made life worth living. His first targets were not the most powerful heroes or the most dangerous villains, but rather the symbols of hope and inspiration that gave people reason to believe that their struggles had meaning and purpose. Arkham Asylum, that monument to the possibility of rehabilitation and the triumph of medical science over criminal insanity, became the stage for a demonstration that was both practically effective and symbolically devastating. The guards who died in the assault were not merely obstacles to be overcome, but rather representations of society's faith in the possibility of redemption, their deaths serving as a message that such faith was not merely naive, but actively dangerous to those who maintained it. The execution of what appeared to be the Joker, conducted with the same brutal efficiency that characterized all of the Batman Who Laughs' actions, was designed to send a specific message about the futility of Batman's no-kill rule and the weakness inherent in showing mercy to those who had proven themselves incapable of change. Yet the revelation that this victim had been merely a decoy, another in the series of substitutes that the real Joker employed whenever he sensed genuine danger, demonstrated the depth of psychological warfare being conducted on multiple levels simultaneously. The real Joker's survival and his subsequent appearance in the Batcave waterways represented not merely a tactical complication, but rather the opening move in a game of such complexity that even Batman's analytical mind struggled to comprehend its full implications. The Clown Prince of Crime had orchestrated his own apparent death while ensuring his actual survival, creating conditions that would force Batman to confront the very moral certainties that had defined his entire approach to justice and heroism. The toxin that coursed through the Joker's cardiovascular system was revealed to be not merely a weapon of revenge, but rather a test of philosophical commitment, a challenge that forced its target to choose between maintaining their principles and accepting defeat, or abandoning those principles in pursuit of victory. The diabolical genius of this approach lay in its recognition that for someone like Batman, the choice itself was a form of defeat, as any decision would require him to betray some fundamental aspect of his identity. As the Batman Who Laughs established his presence in Gotham City, his actions were characterized not by the random violence that had marked the Joker's campaigns, but rather by a systematic approach to the destruction of meaning itself. Each target was selected not for its strategic value, but for its symbolic importance. Each death carefully orchestrated to demonstrate that heroism was not merely ineffective, but actively harmful to those it claimed to protect. The criminal organizations that had once operated in Gotham's shadows found themselves facing an opponent who understood their motivations and methods with uncomfortable intimacy, yet who was not bound by the moral constraints that had previously limited Batman's effectiveness against them. The Penguin, Two-Face, and other established villains discovered that their elaborate schemes and carefully constructed personas meant nothing to someone who viewed them not as complex individuals with understandable motivations, but rather as problems to be solved through the application of overwhelming force. The transformation of Gotham City under the Batman Who Laughs influence was not merely a matter of increased violence or criminal activity, but rather a fundamental alteration in the city's relationship with concepts like hope, justice, and the possibility of redemption. The citizens who had once looked to the sky for the sight of the bat signal, who had drawn comfort from knowing that someone was watching over them, now found themselves confronted with the reality that their protector had become their greatest threat. The psychological impact of this revelation extended far beyond the immediate physical danger posed by the Batman Who Laughs and his followers, creating a crisis of faith that undermined the very foundations of social order and civic cooperation. If Batman, the symbol of incorruptible justice and unwavering moral certainty, could be transformed into an agent of chaos and destruction, then what hope existed for ordinary people to maintain their own ethical standards in the face of adversity? The methodical hunting of alternate Bruce Waynes from across the multiverse served multiple purposes in the Batman Who Laughs campaign, providing not only tactical advantages through the elimination of potential opposition, but also psychological warfare aimed at demonstrating the futility of heroism itself. Each murdered alternate represented a different path that Bruce Wayne might have taken, a different set of choices that had led to different outcomes, yet all had ultimately proven inadequate to prevent their own destruction at the hands of their darkest reflection. These killings were not random acts of violence, but rather carefully orchestrated demonstrations designed to show that no version of heroism, no matter how pure or effective, could ultimately triumph over the kind of focused malevolence that the Batman Who Laughs represented. The perfect Bruce Wayne who had chosen happiness over vengeance, the mayoral Bruce Wayne who had chosen politics over vigilantism, the various other iterations who had found different ways to honor their parents' memory, all had fallen before the inexorable advance of their corrupted counterpart. The implications of these systematic executions extended beyond their immediate tactical value to encompass broader questions about the nature of free will and moral choice in a universe where such dark possibilities could manifest as concrete threats. If every possible version of Bruce Wayne was vulnerable to destruction by this ultimate expression of what he might become, then what meaning could be attributed to the choices that had shaped their individual paths? As the Batman Who Laughs consolidated his position in our reality, his actions began to reveal the ultimate scope of his ambitions, plans that extended far beyond the conquest of a single city or even a single world, to encompass the transformation of existence itself according to his twisted vision of perfect order through absolute despair. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not merely Batman's physical and tactical abilities, but rather the very foundations of his belief in the possibility of redemption and the meaningful nature of heroic sacrifice. In the depths beneath Wayne Manor, where the limestone caverns that had sheltered bats for millennia had been transformed into humanity's most sophisticated bastion against the forces of chaos and despair, there unfolded a scene so profound in its implications for the nature of heroism and sacrifice that it would forever alter the relationship between Gotham's greatest protector and the madman who had defined the boundaries of his moral universe through decades of escalating conflict and mutual dependence. The Joker emerged from the dark waters of the cave's underground river system like some primordial creature, ascending from the depths of the unconscious mind, his pale flesh glistening with moisture that seemed to reflect not merely the cave's artificial illumination, but something deeper and more unsettling, as though he carried within himself the phosphorescent glow of decay and corruption made manifest. His appearance was both theatrical and genuinely disturbing, a masterpiece of calculated presentation that managed to be simultaneously absurd and terrifying in the way that only the Joker could achieve through his unique understanding of the thin line between comedy and horror. The surgical scar that bisected his chest, still raw from Alfred's meticulous work in attempting to repair the damage from his self-inflicted gunshot wound, served as a visible reminder of the lengths to which the clown prince of crime was willing to go in pursuit of what he believed to be the ultimate punchline to his eternal conflict with Batman. This was not merely physical disfigurement, but rather a badge of commitment to a vision so twisted that it transformed self-destruction into a form of victory, pain into a source of satisfaction, and death itself into merely another tool to be employed in the service of chaos. Batman's initial response to the Joker's dramatic entrance was characterized by the same careful mixture of vigilance and restraint that had defined their relationship for years. a delicate balance between the recognition of genuine threat and the acknowledgement that his greatest enemy was also, in some perverse way, essential to his own identity and purpose. The promise of safety that Batman offered was not merely tactical necessity, but also reflected his deeper understanding that the Joker, for all his madness and malevolence, remained a sentient being whose existence carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate danger he posed to innocent lives. Yet, the Joker's response to this offered sanctuary revealed the depth of his transformation from mere criminal mastermind to something approaching a force of nature, an embodiment of cosmic principles that operated according to rules far more fundamental than those governing ordinary human psychology. His rejection of safety was not born from bravado or tactical calculation, but from a genuine philosophical commitment to the idea that safety itself was an illusion, a comfortable lie that prevented people from confronting the true nature of existence as a fundamentally chaotic and meaningless process. The weapon that the Joker produced from beneath his coat was both absurd and terrifying in its implications. A trick gun that had been modified to serve as an instrument of suicide, disguised as a threat against his longtime nemesis. The genius of this device lay not in its mechanical sophistication, but in its psychological complexity, as it forced Batman to confront the possibility that even the Joker's apparent attempts at violence might be elaborate deceptions, designed to achieve goals that could not be accomplished through direct action. The moment when the trigger was pulled and the gun's barrel exploded inward, driving its payload directly into the Joker's own heart rather than toward its apparent target, represented the culmination of years of planning and preparation for this single, perfect act of self-destruction that would achieve what no scheme or plot had ever managed to accomplish. The Joker had finally found a way to win their eternal game, not through defeating Batman, but through forcing him to confront choices that would make victory indistinguishable from defeat. Batman's desperate rush to his fallen enemy's side, his frantic attempts to provide medical assistance to someone who had spent decades trying to destroy everything he held sacred, revealed the profound complexity of their relationship and the degree to which even hatred could be transformed into something approaching love when it was sustained over sufficient time and tested by sufficient extremity. The anguish in his voice as he pleaded with the Joker to explain his actions was not merely tactical frustration, but genuine grief for the loss of someone who had come to define the very meaning of his existence through opposition. The Joker's final words before the toxin began to take effect carried the weight of prophecy and curse combined, a summation of everything their conflict had taught him about the nature of heroism and the prices it demanded from those who embraced it. His declaration that the only way to defeat the Batman who laughs was to become him represented not merely tactical advice, but a fundamental challenge to the moral framework that had guided Batman's entire approach to crime fighting and the protection of innocent life. The toxin that began seeping from the Joker's damaged heart was unlike any of the chemical compounds he had employed in previous schemes, representing not merely another weapon in his arsenal of chaos, but rather the distillation of his essential nature into its purest and most concentrated form. This was not a substance that merely altered brain chemistry or induced temporary madness, but rather something that rewrote the fundamental programming of consciousness itself, preserving intelligence and memory, while inverting the moral framework that determined how those capabilities were employed. Alfred's immediate response to this crisis demonstrated the depth of his dedication to Bruce Wayne's welfare and his sophisticated understanding of the medical emergency they faced, as he recognized that conventional antidotes would be inadequate to address a toxin that operated according to principles that transcended normal biochemistry. The surgical procedures he initiated were not merely attempts at physical healing, but rather desperate measures to buy time while more comprehensive solutions could be developed and implemented. The conversation between Bruce and Alfred as the surgery progressed revealed the profound ethical complexity of their situation, as they were forced to confront the possibility that allowing the Joker to die might be not merely permissible, but actually morally necessary to prevent the spread of whatever contamination his death would release. The utilitarian calculation that suggested sacrificing one life to save many was complicated by Batman's absolute commitment to preserving all life, regardless of the apparent worthlessness or danger of the individual in question. Batman's adamant refusal to consider allowing the Joker's death was rooted not in sentimentality or misplaced compassion, but in his recognition that compromising his principles under extreme circumstances would represent the first step toward the kind of moral flexibility that could eventually justify any action in service of supposedly greater goods. The slippery slope from acceptable sacrifice to acceptable murder was one that he had observed in others and was determined never to traverse himself, regardless of the immediate costs of maintaining such rigid ethical standards. The medical countermeasures that Batman immediately began implementing to slow the toxin's effects on his own system represented years of preparation for exactly this contingency, as he had long recognized that his relationship with the Joker made some form of chemical or biological attack not merely possible, but inevitable. The various antitoxins and neutralizing agents that he injected into his bloodstream were the products of extensive research into Joker venom and its variants, yet they proved inadequate against this perfect strain that had been designed specifically to overcome such defenses. The initial symptoms of the toxin's influence were subtle yet profoundly disturbing in their implications for Batman's psychological stability and moral reasoning. The enhanced sensory perception that allowed him to detect previously unnoticed details in his environment came paired with an altered emotional response to those observations, as situations that should have provoked concern or compassion instead generated amusement or satisfaction. The gradual inversion of his emotional responses represented the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately threaten everything he had worked to build and protect. The most insidious aspect of the toxin's effects was not the obvious changes in behavior or perception, but rather the way it gradually altered the internal narrative that Batman used to justify his actions and interpret the world around him. Where once he had seen criminals as individuals who might be redeemed through proper intervention and rehabilitation, the toxin whispered that they were irredeemably corrupt, and that mercy shown to them was actually cruelty inflicted upon their future victims. This shift in perspective was so gradual and seemingly logical that it bypassed the conscious moral reasoning that might have recognized and resisted more obvious forms of mental manipulation. The physical symptoms that accompanied the psychological transformation were equally disturbing, as Batman's facial muscles began to respond involuntarily to stimuli that should have triggered concern or anger, creating inappropriate smiles and eventually uncontrollable laughter that served as external manifestations of the internal corruption that was systematically rewriting his essential nature. The horror of these symptoms lay not in their physical discomfort, but in their representation of the loss of control over the most basic aspects of self-expression and emotional response. Alfred's attempts to monitor and counteract the toxin's progress were hampered by the unprecedented nature of the contamination they faced, as conventional medical approaches proved inadequate to address a condition that operated according to principles that seemed to transcend normal biochemistry and venture into the realm of metaphysical transformation. The various treatments he administered provided temporary relief from specific symptoms, but could not address the fundamental alteration that was occurring at the cellular level throughout Batman's nervous system. The philosophical discussions that took place during this period of gradual transformation revealed the depth of Batman's understanding of what was happening to him and his determination to maintain his essential moral commitments even as the toxin worked to undermine them. His recognition that the change was not merely chemical but psychological, not merely temporary but potentially permanent, added urgency to his efforts to complete whatever mission the Joker's sacrifice had been intended to enable before he lost the capacity for moral reasoning entirely. The Joker's continued presence in the cave, maintained through Alfred's heroic medical efforts, served as both inspiration and warning for what Batman might become if the toxin's effects progressed to their ultimate conclusion. The observation of his enemy's condition provided crucial insights into the nature of the transformation he was experiencing, while also demonstrating that consciousness and intelligence could be preserved even when fundamental moral orientation was completely inverted. The analysis of the toxin's chemical composition revealed sophisticated understanding of neurology and biochemistry that far exceeded anything the Joker had previously demonstrated, suggesting either that he had received assistance from unknown sources or that his madness had unlocked intellectual capabilities that had remained dormant during his previous criminal activities. The precision with which the toxin targeted specific neural pathways while leaving others intact indicated design principles that bordered on the miraculous in their sophistication and effectiveness. As the toxin continued to circulate through Batman's system and the initial countermeasures proved inadequate to halt its progress, the cave became a laboratory for studying the intersection of psychology and chemistry, consciousness and corruption, heroism and its potential for transformation into something utterly opposed to its original nature. The data collected during this period would prove invaluable for understanding not only the specific threat posed by the Batman Who Laughs, but also the broader questions about the nature of moral identity and the factors that could cause even the most committed individuals to abandon their fundamental principios. The growing realization that conventional medical intervention would be insufficient to reverse the toxin's effects forced Batman to confront the possibility that the Joker's final gift might indeed be irreversible, that the choice between maintaining his moral identity and gaining the power necessary to defeat his twisted counterpart might represent a genuine dilemma with no solution that preserved both his principles and his effectiveness. This recognition marked the beginning of a psychological journey that would test every assumption about the relationship between means and ends, the nature of necessary sacrifice, and the prices that could be accepted in service of the greater good. The internal war that began raging within Batman's consciousness as the toxin gained strength was not merely a conflict between good and evil, but rather a more complex struggle between different definitions of what it meant to serve justice and protect the innocent. The altered perspective provided by the toxin's influence suggested that his previous methods had been inadequate, that his refusal to use lethal force had actually enabled greater suffering by allowing dangerous criminals to escape and repeat their crimes, that true compassion sometimes required actions that appeared cruel to those who lacked the wisdom to understand their necessity. The seductive nature of these altered perceptions lay in their internal consistency and apparent logical foundation, as the toxin did not simply make evil appear good, but rather provided a complete philosophical framework that justified any action in service of supposedly noble goals. The transformation was so gradual and seemingly reasonable that it bypassed the conscious resistance that might have defeated more obvious forms of mental manipulation, instead working through the victim's own intelligence and moral reasoning to achieve its corrupting effects. As this internal transformation progressed and the external symptoms became more pronounced, the cave took on an atmosphere of impending tragedy that reflected the recognition by all present that they were witnessing not merely a medical emergency, but the potential end of Batman as a force for justice and protection in the Aaliyah world. The implications of losing not just Bruce Wayne but the entire moral framework he represented extended far beyond the immediate tactical considerations to encompass questions about the nature of heroism itself and whether it could survive. The kind of fundamental challenges that the modern world seemed increasingly capable of producing. In the labyrinthine depths beneath Gotham City, where the forgotten architects of a bygone era had embedded within the very foundations of their metropolis secrets that would not be revealed for over a century, Batman found himself confronting revelations about his adopted home that challenged everything he thought he understood about the relationship between urban planning, social engineering, and the exercise of power over civilian populations who remained blissfully unaware of the mechanisms that governed their daily existence. The Last Laugh Protocol represented the culmination of decades of careful preparation and technological innovation, a comprehensive system that Bruce Wayne had developed in secret consultation with the most brilliant minds in engineering, environmental science, and urban infrastructure management. This was not merely another gadget in Batman's arsenal, but rather a complete reimagining of how a modern city could be protected against catastrophic threats that exceeded the capacity of conventional emergency response systems to address effectively. The inspiration for such an elaborate failsafe had emerged from Batman's analysis of previous citywide crises that had demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional approaches to disaster management when confronted with threats that operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of cause and effect. The Joker's periodic attempts to poison Gotham's water supply, Scarecrow's airborne terror toxins, and various other chemical and biological threats had revealed vulnerabilities in the city's infrastructure that could be exploited by any enemy with sufficient knowledge and resources to mount a coordinated assault against civilian populations. The engineering challenges involved in creating a system capable of isolating an entire metropolitan area while maintaining essential services required innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with current technology, demanding solutions to problems that had never before been attempted on such a scale. The network of tunnels, pumping stations, air filtration systems, and power generation facilities that comprised the Last Laugh Protocol represented an investment of resources that dwarfed most national infrastructure projects, yet had been accomplished entirely through private funding, channeled through a maze of shell corporations and charitable foundations that obscured the true source and purpose of the expenditures. The psychological impact of possessing such a system was as significant as its practical applications, for it provided Batman with the knowledge that he possessed the capability to protect Gotham's citizens from virtually any conceivable threat, regardless of its scope or sophistication. This sense of preparedness and control was essential to maintaining the mental equilibrium necessary for effective crime fighting, as it reduced the anxiety and uncertainty that might otherwise have undermined his ability to function under extreme stress while making life or death decisions that affected millions of people. Yet the same system that had been designed as the ultimate expression of Batman's protective instincts also represented a potential instrument of unprecedented control over the lives and freedoms of Gotham's citizens, a capability that could be misused by anyone who gained access to its control mechanisms. The philosophical implications of such concentrated power were not lost on Bruce Wayne, who had structured the system's activation protocols to require multiple authentication steps and collaborative authorization, precisely because he understood the corrupting potential of absolute authority over others' lives. The revelation that the Batman Who Laughs not only knew of the Last Laugh Protocol's existence, but understood its operational principles and strategic implications with intimate detail, represented a form of intellectual violation that struck at the core of Batman's sense of security and strategic advantage. This knowledge could not have been acquired through conventional surveillance or intelligence gathering, but rather suggested a level of understanding that could only come from someone who had been involved in the system's design and implementation, someone who thought with Batman's own analytical processes and shared his deepest concerns about protecting innocent life. The systematic destruction of Wayne Tower, that gleaming monument to legitimate enterprise and technological innovation that had served as both symbol and operational center for Bruce Wayne's legitimate activities, was conducted with the kind of precision and thorough understanding of structural engineering that demonstrated the Batman Who Laughs retention of all the technical knowledge and strategic thinking that had made Batman such an effective protector of his city. The explosives were placed not randomly, but according to a calculated plan that would maximize structural damage while minimizing the risk to surrounding buildings, a consideration that revealed the persistence of certain protective instincts, even within his corrupted psyche. The loss of Wayne Tower represented more than merely the destruction of a building or even the elimination of a strategic resource, but rather the symbolic announcement that the old order of protection and security that Batman had worked to establish was ending, that the comfortable assumptions about heroism and its capacity to triumph over evil were being systematically dismantled by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of their weaknesses and limitations. The psychological impact of watching his life's work reduced to rubble was compounded by the recognition that this destruction had been accomplished by a version of himself, making it not merely an external attack, but a form of cosmic suicide. The introduction of James Gordon Jr. into this crisis represented Batman's recognition that conventional approaches to criminal psychology and threat assessment would be inadequate when dealing with an enemy whose thought processes were fundamentally alien, yet retained enough familiar elements to make prediction and countermeasures extremely difficult. The younger Gordon's unique combination of intellectual brilliance and controlled psychopathy provided insights into criminal thinking that were unavailable through any other source. Yet utilizing such assistance required Batman to compromise his normal ethical standards regarding the treatment of mentally ill individuals. James Gordon Jr.'s clinical analysis of his own psychological condition and the various treatments that had been employed to manage his dangerous impulses provided valuable insights into the nature of criminal insanity and the possibilities for rehabilitation. Yet his continued participation in Batman's investigation represented a calculated risk that such cooperation might provide him with opportunities to resume his own criminal activities under the cover of assisting law enforcement. The medication regimen that maintained his current stability was neither permanent nor completely reliable, creating the possibility that stress or opportunity might trigger a relapse into his former patterns of violence and manipulation. The philosophical discussions that arose during their collaboration touched upon fundamental questions about the nature of justice, the effectiveness of rehabilitation versus punishment, and the moral obligations that society owed to individuals whose mental illness manifested as dangerous criminal behavior. James Gordon Jr.'s perspective on Batman's no-kill rule was particularly illuminating, as he argued from the position of someone who had personally experienced the desire to kill and could therefore evaluate the practical consequences of showing mercy to those who were constitutionally incapable of reform or redemption. His contention that Batman's refusal to employ lethal force actually enabled greater suffering by allowing dangerous criminals to escape and repeat their crimes represented a challenge to one of the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire concept of heroic intervention in criminal activity. The logic of his argument was difficult to refute on purely utilitarian grounds, as the mathematical calculation of lives saved versus lives lost through various approaches to crime fighting, generally favored more permanent solutions to the problem of repeat offenders who showed no capacity for change or rehabilitation. Yet the counter-argument that emerged from Batman's consideration of this perspective emphasized not the immediate tactical advantages of lethal force, but rather the long-term consequences of abandoning the moral constraints that distinguished heroism from vigilantism, justice from vengeance, and protection from domination. The slippery slope from acceptable killing in extreme circumstances to routine execution of anyone deemed irredeemable was one that Batman had observed in others and was determined never to begin traversing, regardless of the apparent logic that might justify such an evolution in his methods. The growing influence of the Joker toxin in Batman's system added urgency to these philosophical debates, as his capacity for moral reasoning was being systematically undermined by chemical processes that enhanced certain cognitive functions while corrupting others. The enhanced analytical capabilities that allowed him to perceive patterns and connections that had previously been invisible came paired with altered emotional responses that made violence and cruelty appear not merely acceptable, but actually preferable to the inefficient mercy that had characterized his previous approach to crime fighting. The most insidious aspect of this transformation was its apparent reasonableness, as the toxin did not simply make evil appear good, but rather provided a complete philosophical framework that justified any action in service of supposedly noble goals. The enhanced perception of human nature that the toxin provided suggested that most people were fundamentally selfish and corrupt, that mercy was actually cruelty disguised as virtue, and that true compassion required the elimination of those who posed ongoing threats to innocent life. The systematic hunting of alternate Bruce Waynes from across the multiverse served multiple strategic purposes in the Batman Who Laughs campaign, providing not only the elimination of potential opposition, but also psychological warfare, designed to demonstrate that every possible approach to heroism ultimately led to the same destination of failure and corruption. Each murdered alternate represented a different set of choices that Bruce Wayne might have made. Different responses to the trauma of his parents' death, different methods of channeling his pain and anger into something resembling productive action. The mayor, Bruce Wayne, who had chosen political engagement over vigilante activity, had succeeded in implementing systematic reforms that addressed many of the social conditions that created criminal behavior, yet had ultimately proven vulnerable to the same kind of focused malevolence that threatened all who sought to improve the human condition. His death served as a demonstration that working within existing systems, however noble the intention and however effective the immediate results, could not provide adequate protection against enemies who operated outside all conventional constraints and moral limitations. The revelation that Commissioner Gordon had been captured and was being held by the Grim Knight added personal stakes to what had previously been primarily an intellectual and strategic challenge, as Batman was forced to confront the possibility that his methods of investigation and his choices regarding allies and collaborators might have contributed to endangering someone whose only crime was his dedication to legitimate law enforcement and his willingness to support Batman's activities despite their legally questionable nature. The Grim Knight's particular animosity toward law enforcement personnel reflected his origin in a reality where the traditional cooperation between vigilante and police that had characterized Batman's relationship with Commissioner Gordon had instead devolved into open warfare, with both sides employing increasingly extreme methods in pursuit of their respective visions of justice and order. This alternate version of Batman had concluded that conventional law enforcement was not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive, that its commitment to legal procedures and constitutional protections actually enabled criminal activity by providing loopholes and delays that clever criminals could exploit. The Court of Owl's swift and decisive defeat at the hands of the Batman Who Laughs demonstrated that even the most sophisticated and well-established criminal organizations were inadequate to oppose someone who combined Batman's tactical abilities with the Joker's complete lack of moral restraint. Yet, their involvement in the crisis also revealed the extent to which Gotham's infrastructure and governance had been compromised by secret societies and hidden agendas that operated beyond the reach of normal democratic accountability. The ease with which the Batman Who Laughs eliminated the court's Talon assassins and intimidated their leadership into submission suggested that his knowledge of Gotham's criminal underworld extended far beyond what any individual investigation could have uncovered, implying either extensive prior research or access to information sources that remained unavailable to legitimate law enforcement. This superior intelligence gave him tactical advantages that could not be overcome through superior numbers or conventional strategic planning, making him effectively unstoppable by any enemy who relied upon normal criminal organization and methodology. The psychological warfare that accompanied these physical confrontations was designed not merely to eliminate opposition, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance, to convince potential enemies that their efforts would not only fail but would actually contribute to greater suffering for the people they sought to protect. The Batman Who Laughs approach to conflict was characterized not by the desire for quick victory, but rather by the commitment to thorough demoralization that would prevent future opposition from even attempting to form or organize effective resistance. The revelation that the Last Laugh Protocol could be turned from a defensive system into an offensive weapon represented the kind of tactical reversal that demonstrated the Batman Who Laughs' superior understanding of both technology and psychology, his ability to identify vulnerabilities in systems that had been designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of attack he was mounting. The system that Batman had created to protect Gotham from external contamination could be modified to isolate the city for exactly the opposite purpose, creating a laboratory for experiments in social control and psychological manipulation that would be impossible in a normal urban environment. The realization that he had been outmaneuvered so completely that his greatest achievement in protecting Gotham had been turned into the instrument of its potential destruction forced Batman to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of his own strategic thinking, and the possibility that his entire approach to crime fighting had been based upon assumptions that were not merely incorrect, but actively dangerous to the people he sought to protect. The growing influence of the toxin in his system added complexity to these revelations by providing enhanced analytical capabilities that allowed him to perceive the elegant logic of his enemy's plan, while simultaneously undermining his emotional capacity to feel appropriate horror at its implications. The appreciation he felt for the Batman Who Laughs' strategic brilliance was itself a symptom of his ongoing corruption, evidence that his fundamental moral orientation was being systematically inverted through processes that preserved his intelligence while destroying his humanity. As the Last Laugh Protocol moved closer to activation and the scope of the crisis became fully apparent, Batman found himself confronting not merely a tactical challenge, but an existential crisis that threatened everything he believed about the nature of heroism, justice, and the possibility of protecting innocent life in a universe that seemed increasingly hostile to such noble aspirations. In the desperate hours that followed the destruction of Wayne Tower and the activation of protocols that had transformed Gotham City from a beacon of hope into an isolated fortress of potential despair, Batman found himself confronting the harsh reality that conventional approaches to heroism and crime fighting were not merely inadequate, but actively counterproductive when dealing with enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of his methods, motivations, and psychological vulnerabilities. The alliance that formed in response to this crisis represented a fundamental departure from his normal operational procedures, requiring him to place trust in individuals whose reliability and moral orientation were questionable at best. The relationship between Commissioner James Gordon and his son had always been characterized by complexity and ambivalence that reflected broader questions about family loyalty, personal responsibility, and the extent to which love could survive the revelation of fundamental moral incompatibility. James Gordon Jr.'s transformation from promising young man to calculating psychopath had been gradual enough that his father had been forced to witness each stage of deterioration, to recognize the signs of developing pathology while remaining powerless to prevent or reverse the process through conventional parental intervention or professional therapeutic assistance. The medication regimen that had made their current collaboration possible represented years of experimental treatment and careful monitoring by psychiatric professionals who understood that they were dealing not merely with criminal insanity but with a form of psychological condition that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and moral reasoning. The drugs that maintained James Gordon Jr.'s current stability were neither permanent solutions nor complete cures, but rather chemical constraints that suppressed certain aspects of his personality while leaving others intact, creating a version of himself that could function in normal social situations while retaining access to the analytical capabilities that made him valuable as a consultant on criminal psychology. The ethical complexity of utilizing such assistance was not lost on Batman, whose commitment to protecting innocent life had to be balanced against his recognition that desperate circumstances sometimes required the employment of resources that would be unacceptable under normal conditions. James Gordon Jr.'s unique perspective on criminal thinking and his clinical understanding of psychopathic behavior patterns provided insights that were unavailable through any other source. Yet, his continued participation in their investigation created risks that extended far beyond the immediate tactical considerations, to encompass broader questions about the precedents being established for future cooperation with known criminals. The philosophical discussions that arose during their collaboration revealed fundamental tensions between different approaches to justice and crime prevention that had significant implications for understanding the nature of Batman's mission and its effectiveness in achieving its stated goals. James Gordon Jr.'s critique of Batman's no-kill rule was particularly challenging because it emerged not from emotional reaction or personal animosity, but from careful analysis of statistical data regarding recidivism rates, victim impact studies, and resource allocation within the criminal justice system. His argument that Batman's refusal to employ lethal force actually enabled greater suffering by allowing dangerous criminals to escape justice and repeat their crimes was supported by compelling evidence drawn from case studies spanning decades of criminal activity in Gotham City. The mathematical calculation of lives that could have been saved if certain repeat offenders had been permanently eliminated during their first encounters with Batman was difficult to dispute on purely utilitarian grounds. Yet it also represented a form of moral reasoning that Batman found fundamentally incompatible with his understanding of what distinguished heroism from vigilantism. The counter-argument that emerged from Batman's consideration of these statistics emphasized not the immediate tactical advantages of more permanent solutions, but rather the long-term consequences of abandoning the moral constraints that prevented heroes from becoming tyrants, protectors from becoming oppressors, and justice from becoming indistinguishable from revenge. The slippery slope from justified killing in extreme circumstances to routine execution of those deemed irredeemable was one that he had observed in others, and was determined never to begin traversing. regardless of the apparent logic that might support such an evolution in his methods. Yet the growing influence of the Joker toxin in his system was making these philosophical distinctions increasingly difficult to maintain, as the chemical alteration of his neural pathways enhanced certain cognitive functions while systematically undermining others. The enhanced analytical capabilities that allowed him to perceive previously hidden patterns in criminal behavior and social dynamics came paired with altered emotional responses that made violence appear not merely acceptable, but actually preferable to the inefficient mercy that had characterized his previous approach to crime fighting. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was its apparent reasonableness, as the toxin did not simply reverse his moral polarity, but rather provided what appeared to be more sophisticated and comprehensive understanding of human nature and social dynamics. The enhanced perception that the chemical alteration provided suggested that his previous commitment to non-lethal methods had been based upon naive optimism about human capacity for redemption rather than realistic assessment of criminal psychology and recidivism patterns. The dark visor that Batman constructed using fragments of the same exotic metal that comprised the Batman Who Laughs equipment represented a desperate attempt to gain tactical advantage through the adoption of tools and methods that he would normally have rejected as too dangerous for safe operation. The decision to create and employ such a device demonstrated the extent to which the crisis had forced him to compromise his normal safety protocols and risk exposure to influences that could accelerate his ongoing psychological transformation. The visor's ability to reveal hidden desires and motivations in others provided unprecedented insight into the psychological landscape of human behavior. Yet this enhanced perception came at the cost of increased vulnerability to the corrupting influence of the dark multiverse itself. Each use of the device exposed Batman to energies and perspectives that originated from realities where heroism had failed completely, where every noble intention had been perverted into its opposite, where the very concept of hope had been systematically eliminated through the triumph of despair over aspiration. Alfred's intervention during Batman's attempted use of the visor represented more than simple concern for his ward's physical safety, but rather a recognition that the psychological corruption spreading through Bruce Wayne's consciousness was threatening to destroy everything that had made him an effective force for justice and protection. The physical confrontation that followed between the two men who had shared decades of mutual trust and cooperation was unprecedented in their relationship. Yet it also demonstrated the extent to which the toxin was systematically undermining Batman's capacity for normal human connection and emotional regulation. The violence of their struggle was matched by the cruelty of the words that Batman spoke during their conflict, as he gave voice to resentments and criticisms that he had never before acknowledged even to himself, attacking Alfred with observations that were designed to cause maximum psychological damage rather than to resolve their disagreement through rational discussion. The toxin's influence was evident, not merely in his willingness to engage in physical violence against someone he loved, but in his apparent satisfaction at causing emotional pain to the person who had sacrificed his own life, and happiness to support Batman's mission. The temporary restoration of their normal relationship that followed this confrontation demonstrated that Bruce Wayne's essential personality and moral commitments remained accessible beneath the layer of chemical corruption, yet it also revealed how precarious his mental state had become, and how easily his fundamental loyalties and emotional connections could be disrupted by the ongoing alteration of his brain chemistry. The apologies and reconciliation that occurred were genuine yet incomplete, as both men recognized that the underlying cause of their conflict remained unresolved, and that similar incidents would likely occur with increasing frequency as the toxin's influence continued to strengthen. The heart-to-heart conversation between Batman and the Joker that took place in the depths of Gotham's water treatment facilities represented one of the most psychologically complex interactions in their decades-long relationship, as it revealed the extent to which their mutual obsession had created a form of intimacy that transcended normal categories of friendship and enmity. The Joker's admission that he had never actually wanted Batman to become like him, that their eternal conflict was more valuable to him than any possible victory, provided insights into his motivations that had previously been hidden beneath layers of apparent randomness and chaos. The philosophical framework that emerged from their conversation suggested that their relationship had evolved beyond simple opposition between order and chaos into something approaching a form of cosmic balance, where each participant served as a check against the other's potential excesses, while also providing the existential meaning that made their individual existence worthwhile. The Joker's recognition that Batman's transformation into the Batman who laughs would represent not victory, but rather the destruction of everything that had made their conflict meaningful, demonstrated a level of self-awareness that was rarely visible beneath his facade of madness and unpredictability. Batman's request that the Joker serve as a failsafe against his complete transformation represented the ultimate expression of trust between two beings who had spent decades trying to destroy each other. Yet it also revealed the depth of his desperation and his recognition that conventional support systems would be inadequate to address the specific nature of his corruption. The agreement they reached was not merely tactical but genuinely emotional, reflecting their mutual understanding that their relationship had become essential to both their identities in ways that transcended their apparent opposition. The Grim Knight's systematic campaign against Commissioner Gordon represented more than simple revenge for past defeats, but rather a deliberate attempt to demonstrate that law enforcement and heroic intervention were fundamentally inadequate to address the kind of focused malevolence that he embodied. His methods were characterized not merely by violence, but by psychological warfare, designed to break his victims' faith in the institutions and principles that had guided his professional life, to convince him that his commitment to legal procedures and constitutional protections had been naive idealism that enabled rather than prevented criminal activity. The revelation that the Grim Knight's universe had never produced the kind of cooperative relationship between vigilante and police that had characterized Batman's partnership with Gordon demonstrated how small differences in initial conditions could lead to vastly different outcomes in the development of crime-fighting methodologies and their social acceptance. Where Batman had worked to establish trust and mutual respect with law enforcement, the Grim Knight had concluded that such cooperation was impossible, and had instead chosen to treat police as enemies whose adherence to legal constraints made them obstacles to effective justice. The Court of Owl's swift defeat at the hands of the Batman Who Laughs served multiple purposes in his overall campaign, eliminating potential opposition, while also demonstrating that even the most sophisticated and well-established criminal organizations were inadequate to resist someone who combined superior intelligence with complete moral flexibility, their centuries of accumulated power and influence, their network of assassins and political connections, their mastery of hidden knowledge and secret influence, all proved worthless against an opponent who understood their methods while remaining unbound by any of the constraints that had previously limited criminal conflict in Gotham City. The ease with which he eliminated their Talon enforcers and intimidated their leadership into submission revealed not merely superior tactical capabilities, but also philosophical clarity about the relationship between power and its exercise that allowed him to act with decisiveness that his enemies found impossible to match or counter. where traditional criminal organizations were hampered by internal politics, competing interests, and the need to maintain plausible deniability for their actions. The Batman Who Laughs operated according to principles so fundamental and uncompromising that they provided clear guidance for every decision and eliminated the hesitation that might have allowed opposition to organize effective resistance. The various alternate Bruce Waynes, who continued to appear and die throughout this period, served as both tactical assets and psychological weapons in the Batman Who Laughs' campaign, providing him with resources and capabilities drawn from different developmental paths, while also demonstrating to his primary opponent that every possible approach to heroism ultimately led to the same destination of failure and corruption. Each death was carefully orchestrated to maximize its symbolic impact while also eliminating specific threats to his plans, creating a pattern of elimination that was both practically effective and philosophically coherent. The mayor, Bruce Wayne, who had chosen political engagement over vigilante activity, represented the path of working within existing systems to address social problems through legal and democratic means. Yet his murder demonstrated that such approaches were ultimately inadequate when confronted with enemies who operated outside all conventional constraints and moral limitations. The corporate Bruce Wayne, who had focused on using his wealth and influence to address the economic roots of crime, had achieved significant measurable improvements in social conditions. Yet he too had proven vulnerable to focused malevolence that transcended normal criminal motivation and methodology. These systematic eliminations served not merely to reduce opposition but to provide object lessons about the futility of hope and the inevitable triumph of despair over aspiration in any conflict where the stakes were sufficiently high and the opposition sufficiently committed to victory regardless of cost. Each alternate Bruce Wayne had represented a different answer to the question of how trauma and loss could be transformed into constructive action, yet all had ultimately failed when confronted with their own darkest reflection. The growing realization that his every strategic decision and tactical response had been anticipated and incorporated into his enemy's planning forced Batman to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of his own analytical capabilities and the possibility that his entire approach to crime fighting had been based upon assumptions that were not merely incorrect, but actively dangerous to the people he sought to protect. The recognition that someone who thought exactly like him, but without moral constraints, would always possess tactical advantages that could not be overcome through superior preparation or more sophisticated technology represented a form of intellectual defeat that was perhaps more devastating than any physical confrontation could have been. As the toxin's influence continued to strengthen and the scope of the crisis became fully apparent, Batman found himself confronting not merely a tactical challenge, but an existential crisis that threatened everything he believed about the nature of heroism, justice, and the possibility of protecting innocent life in a universe that seemed increasingly hostile to such noble aspirations. In the fateful moment when Batman's hand hovered over the activation mechanism for the Last Laugh protocol, the weight of an entire city's destiny pressed upon his consciousness, like the accumulated mass of every decision he had ever made in service of justice and protection. Yet the growing influence of the Joker toxin, coursing through his bloodstream, whispered seductive arguments that transformed what should have been an act of desperate defense into something approaching deliberate collaboration with the very forces he had sworn to oppose. The activation of Gotham's isolation systems represented not merely a tactical decision, but a fundamental shift in his understanding of what protection truly meant and what prices could be accepted in pursuit of the greater good. The Last Laugh Protocol's implementation was a marvel of engineering coordination that demonstrated the sophisticated preparation Bruce Wayne had invested in protecting his city from catastrophic threats. Yet its activation under these circumstances served purposes that inverted its original design, from shield into prison, from sanctuary into laboratory for experiments in social control and psychological manipulation. The massive pumping stations that began drawing water from Gotham's surrounding rivers operated with mechanical precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos erupting throughout the city as citizens gradually became aware that their normal connections to the outside world had been severed. Commissioner Gordon's capture and subsequent torture at the hands of the Grim Knight represented more than tactical necessity in the villain's campaign, but rather a deliberate attempt to break the spirit of someone who embodied the possibility that law enforcement and heroic intervention could coexist in service of justice, rather than competing for dominance over criminal elements. The systematic infliction of physical and psychological torment was designed not merely to extract information or eliminate opposition, but to demonstrate that even the most principled representatives of legitimate authority were ultimately powerless when confronted with sufficient commitment to violence and destruction. The underground chambers where this torture was conducted had been converted from Gotham's original sewer systems into something approaching medieval dungeons, complete with implements of pain that reflected the Grim Knight's understanding that effective interrogation required not merely the application of physical suffering, but the creation of psychological conditions that would break his victim's faith in everything that had previously given his life meaning and purpose. The methodical nature of the process revealed intelligence and planning that transcended mere sadism to become something approaching artistry in the application of controlled despair. James Gordon Jr.'s role in the rescue mission that developed represented a fundamental test of whether his apparent rehabilitation through medication and therapy had achieved genuine transformation of his essential nature, or merely suppressed his more dangerous impulses while leaving them intact beneath a veneer of social acceptability. His willingness to risk his own life to save his father suggested that the emotional connections that had been damaged by his psychological condition retained sufficient strength to motivate altruistic behavior when circumstances demanded such sacrifice. Yet the methods he employed in combat against the Grim Knight's forces revealed that his analytical understanding of violence and its most effective applications had not been diminished by his treatment, as he demonstrated tactical capabilities and ruthless efficiency that exceeded what would normally be expected from someone with his limited field experience. The ease with which he transitioned from apparent normalcy to lethal effectiveness suggested that his rehabilitation had been incomplete, that the capacity for violence remained easily accessible beneath the chemical constraints that maintained his current stability. The rabid robins that served as the Grim Knight's enforcers represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his entire operation, as they embodied the systematic corruption of childhood innocence and the transformation of protective instincts into instruments of cruelty and destruction. These creatures bore the physical appearance of children, yet had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into patterns of violence and obedience that they had lost any recognizable trace of normal human emotion or moral reasoning, becoming living weapons that operated according to programming rather than conscious choice. The revelation that these monsters were alternate versions of James Gordon Jr. drawn from across the dark multiverse added layers of psychological horror to their existence, as they represented not merely victims of abuse but specific possibilities for what Commissioner Gordon's son might have become under different circumstances. Each of these twisted reflections had been shaped by experiences that paralleled yet diverged from his own developmental path, creating variations on the theme of genius corrupted by trauma and channeled into destructive rather than constructive applications. The underground battle that erupted as the Gordons fought their way toward the reservoir took place in an environment that had been specifically prepared to maximize the tactical advantages available to defenders, while minimizing the escape routes and defensive positions that might have been available to intruders. The sewer tunnels had been modified with additional passages, concealed weapons emplacements, and environmental hazards that turned the entire infrastructure into a three-dimensional maze designed to confuse and eliminate unauthorized personnel. The psychological warfare that accompanied this physical conflict was equally sophisticated, as the Grim Knight employed his knowledge of Commissioner Gordon's personal history and emotional vulnerabilities to undermine his confidence and fighting effectiveness through carefully selected taunts and revelations. The suggestion that Gordon had failed as a father, that his son's psychological problems were the result of parental inadequacy rather than genetic or environmental factors beyond his control, struck at the core of his self-image and sense of personal worth. James Gordon Jr.'s response to these attacks on his father's character revealed the extent to which his rehabilitation had succeeded in creating genuine emotional connections that transcended his previous pattern of viewing other people primarily as objects, to be manipulated rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. His willingness to defend his father, not merely through physical violence, but through emotional commitment, demonstrated that the medication and therapy had achieved something, approaching authentic transformation of his fundamental priorities and values. The tactical coordination that developed between father and son during their combat against the rabid robins suggested that their relationship had evolved beyond the careful supervision and mutual suspicion that had characterized their rabid, recent interactions to encompass genuine trust and cooperation, based upon shared commitment to protecting innocent life. Their fighting styles complemented each other in ways that reflected both their individual strengths and their growing understanding of how those strengths could be most effectively combined against opponents who possessed superior numbers and environmental advantages. The reservoir chamber, where their mission reached its climax, had been transformed from a utilitarian water treatment facility into something approaching a temple dedicated to the worship of corruption and despair, with modifications that served both practical and symbolic purposes in the Grim Knight's overall campaign. The architectural changes reflected his understanding that psychological warfare required not merely the application of violence, but the creation of environments that reinforced the hopelessness and futility of resistance against superior force and moral flexibility. The contamination that had been introduced into Gotham's water supply represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and scientific research into the specific chemical compounds that would most effectively alter human behavior patterns while remaining virtually undetectable through conventional testing procedures. The toxins that now flowed through the city's circulatory system were designed not to cause immediate death or obvious illness, but rather to gradually alter the psychological makeup of everyone who consumed them, creating conditions that would make the population more susceptible to authoritarian control and less likely to engage in organized resistance. The remote detonation system that controlled the dispersal drones positioned throughout Gotham demonstrated the Grim Knight's understanding that effective terrorism required not merely the capacity to cause destruction, but the ability to threaten such destruction from a position of safety that prevented retaliation or immediate countermeasures. The psychological impact of knowing that death could arrive from the sky at any moment was potentially more valuable than actually deploying such weapons, as it created conditions of perpetual anxiety that undermined social cohesion and individual confidence. Commissioner Gordon's exposure to the contaminated water during his torture and subsequent rescue attempts represented more than mere physical contact with dangerous chemicals, but rather a form of involuntary participation in the commerce transformation that was gradually overtaking the entire city. The absorption of toxins through his skin and respiratory system began processes that would eventually alter his fundamental personality and moral orientation in ways that paralleled what was happening to Batman through his exposure to the process. Joker's final gift. James Gordon Jr.'s decision to turn his weapon against the Grim Knight rather than his father represented the crucial moment when his rehabilitation was tested under conditions of extreme stress and emotional manipulation, proving that his apparent transformation had achieved sufficient depth to override both his previous psychological programming and the immediate tactical advantages that patricide might have provided. The violence with which he dispatched his tormentor reflected not sadistic pleasure, but rather protective fury, directed towards someone who threatened everything he had learned to value during his recovery process. The repeated stabbing that continued long after the Grim Knight had ceased to pose any meaningful threat revealed that James Gordon Jr.'s capacity for violence remained intact despite his medication and therapy, suggesting that his transformation had been more about redirection than elimination of his dangerous impulses. His father's intervention to stop the attack demonstrated understanding that complete victory over one enemy was less important than preventing the regression of his son into patterns of behavior that had previously made him a threat to innocent life. The successful deactivation of the drone dispersal system represented a tactical victory that prevented the immediate poisoning of Gotham's civilian population, yet it also highlighted how close the entire operation had come to succeeding, and how inadequate conventional law enforcement methods would have been against opponents who possessed superior technology, planning, and commitment to their destructive goals. The margin of error that separated success from catastrophic failure was measured in seconds rather than minutes, suggesting that similar threats in the future might not be prevented through the combination of luck and heroism that had saved the city on this occasion. The psychological aftermath of their successful mission was complicated by the recognition that their victory had been incomplete, that the fundamental threat posed by the Batman who laughs remained unaddressed, and that the various contaminations and corruptions that had been introduced into Gotham's systems would continue to spread and cause damage, even after the immediate crisis had been resolved. Commissioner Gordon's exposure to the reservoir toxins meant that he would gradually transform into something resembling the enemy they had just defeated, creating new challenges that would require different approaches and solutions. The bond that had been forged between father and son during their shared ordeal represented genuine progress in healing relationships that had been damaged by years of suspicion and disappointed expectations. Yet it also demonstrated how extreme circumstances could create temporary cooperation that might not survive the return to normal conditions where underlying psychological differences would reassert themselves. The question of whether James Gordon Jr.'s apparent rehabilitation would prove durable under less dramatic circumstances remained open, as did the broader question of whether such transformations were genuinely possible or merely temporary suppression of unchangeable essential characteristics. The knowledge that they had succeeded in preventing immediate catastrophe while failing to address its underlying causes created a complex emotional response that combined satisfaction with realistic assessment of the challenges that lay ahead, reflecting the mature understanding that heroism rarely achieved complete and permanent solutions to the problems it confronted, but rather bought time and opportunity for more comprehensive approaches to be developed and implemented. The victory was meaningful but limited, significant but incomplete, a testament to both the possibilities and the limitations of individual courage and determination when confronted with threats that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior and social dysfunction. As the immediate crisis reached its conclusion and the scope of remaining challenges became apparent, both men found themselves confronting not merely the practical questions of how to address ongoing contamination and corruption, but also the deeper philosophical issues about the nature of justice, the possibilities for redemption, and the prices that could be accepted in pursuit of protecting innocent life from forces that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional moral reasoning and social constraint. In the shadow-drenched cemetery where Thomas and Martha Wayne lay beneath headstones that had weathered decades of Gotham's acid rain and the accumulated weight of their son's grief, the final confrontation between Batman and his most twisted reflection unfolded with the terrible inevitability of Greek tragedy, each participant bound by psychological imperatives so fundamental that deviation from their predetermined roles had become literally inconceivable. The hallowed ground that surrounded them bore witness to generations of Gotham's elite, yet none of the elaborate monuments to wealth and social position could match the symbolic weight of this simple family plot where innocence had been murdered and vengeance had been born. The young Bruce Wayne, who had been transported from his own reality, stood transfixed by the sight of two versions of his future self engaged in mortal combat, his child's mind unable to fully comprehend the cosmic implications of what he was witnessing, yet instinctively understanding that he was observing the ultimate consequences of choices that he had not yet been forced to make. His presence served as a living reminder of what both combatants had once been, a representation of the potential for innocence and joy that had been systematically destroyed through different paths that had led to the same destination of isolated determination to impose order upon chaos through the application of superior will. The Batman Who Laughs decision to bring this child to the confrontation was not merely tactical but profoundly psychological, designed to force his counterpart to confront the reality that their conflict was not simply about competing methodologies for crime fighting, but about fundamental questions regarding the nature of heroism and its relationship to personal happiness. The presence of the boy served as a constant reminder that other paths had been possible, that the sacrifices both men had made in service of their respective visions might not have been inevitable consequences of their parents' murder, but rather choices that could have been made differently. The serum that the Batman Who Laughs carried represented the culmination of his scientific research into the precise chemical processes that had transformed him from protector into destroyer, a concentrated essence of corruption that could accelerate in minutes, the gradual metamorphosis that had taken months to complete during his own transformation. The syringe itself was both weapon and sacrament, an instrument that promised to end their eternal conflict through the simple expedient of eliminating the moral differences that made them enemies rather than allies in the service of perfect order. Batman's response to the injection of additional toxin into his already compromised system was not immediate surrender to corruption, but rather a final desperate mobilization of whatever resistance his original personality could muster against the chemical tide that threatened to wash away everything that had made him a force for justice rather than destruction. The convulsions that racked his body were not merely physical reactions to foreign substances, but visible manifestations of a psychological war being fought at the cellular level between competing definitions of what it meant to serve the fighty, greater good. The grin that began spreading across Batman's face as the toxin took hold was perhaps more terrifying than any expression of rage or hatred could have been, for it represented not conscious choice, but involuntary surrender to influences that operated below the level of deliberate decision-making. The smile was not his own, but rather the chemical signature of corruption that had been designed to override individual will and transform its victims into willing servants of chaos disguised as order. The Batman Who Laugh's satisfaction at witnessing this transformation was complicated by his recognition that victory achieved through chemical coercion was somehow less meaningful than conversion accomplished through philosophical persuasion. Yet his commitment to achieving his ultimate goals transcended such aesthetic considerations. The important thing was not the method by which his counterpart was brought to understanding, but rather the fact that understanding had been achieved, that the last significant obstacle to implementing his vision for reality had been eliminated through the simple expedient of making it impossible for opposition to continue existing. The machine gun that he raised to deliver the final blow was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of the philosophical gulf that separated him from his former identity. As the original Batman's commitment to preserving life had been replaced by practical recognition that some problems could only be solved through the permanent elimination of those who created them. The casual efficiency with which he prepared to execute his defeated enemy reflected not sadism, but rather the same methodical approach to problem solving that had made Batman such an effective crime fighter, now applied to the resolution of conflicts through the simplest possible means. Yet even in his moment of apparent triumph, the Batman Who Laughs found himself confronting evidence that his understanding of human psychology and motivation remained incomplete, for Batman's refusal to surrender completely to the toxin's influence suggested the existence of resources and resistances that transcended normal biochemical processes. The glint of defiance that remained visible in his victim's eyes indicated that some essential aspect of his original identity persisted despite the chemical assault upon his neural pathways, creating uncertainty about whether the transformation was as complete and irreversible as it appeared. The decision to continue with the execution, rather than investigating the sources of this unexpected resistance, demonstrated the Batman Who Laughs' commitment to practical results over intellectual curiosity. His recognition that partial victory, followed by permanent elimination of opposition, was preferable to perfect understanding that might provide opportunities for reversal or escape. The gunshots that followed were not expressions of anger or frustration, but rather methodical applications of lethal force, designed to resolve ambiguity through the simple expedient of making further resistance impossible. Alfred's intervention in this moment of apparent defeat represented more than simple loyalty to his longtime ward, but rather the embodiment of principles that transcended individual relationships to encompass broader questions about the nature of service and the obligations that civilized beings owed to one another, regardless of the immediate practical consequences of fulfilling such obligations. His appearance with a shotgun demonstrated that even the most refined and cultured individuals possessed capacities for violence when circumstances demanded such responses, yet his motivation remained fundamentally defensive rather than aggressive in its orientation. The elderly butler's marksmanship, honed through military service in conflicts that had predated Batman's birth, proved adequate to deliver the kind of devastating, close-range assault that could temporarily incapacitate even someone with the Batman Who Laughs' enhanced durability and pain tolerance. The multiple impacts that tore through his armored costume and underlying flesh created wounds that would have been fatal to normal human physiology, yet his transformation had included enhancements that made such damage painful but not immediately life-threatening. The monologue that Alfred delivered while repeatedly firing into his target's body reflected years of accumulated frustration and horror at witnessing the systematic corruption of everything he had worked to build and protect. Yet it also demonstrated his understanding that this enemy represented not external threat, but rather the darkest possibilities inherent within the very person he had devoted his life to serving. The command to return to the hell from which he had emerged was not merely an expression of anger, but a statement of philosophical position regarding the fundamental incompatibility between creation and destruction, as approaches to achieving meaningful existence. Alfred's heroic stand provided the crucial moments necessary for Batman to recover from his wounds and mobilize whatever resources remained available to him for continuing the fight. Yet it also exposed the elderly man to retaliation from an opponent whose capacity for cruelty had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout their conflict. The boot that connected with Alfred's skull represented not merely tactical necessity but deliberate punishment for his interference in what the Batman Who Laughs viewed as a private matter between versions of the same individual. Batman's return to consciousness and renewed participation in the battle was accompanied by a clarity of purpose that suggested the additional toxin, rather than completing his transformation, had somehow triggered defensive responses that restored access to psychological resources that had been suppressed by the gradual contamination he had experienced over previous days. The question he posed about his failure to complete the expected metamorphosis received an answer that revealed the Batman Who Laughs' incomplete understanding of the factors that determined whether such transformations succeeded or failed. The explanation that Batman offered for his resistance focused on the strategic preparations he had made during the early stages of their conflict, when his analytical capabilities had been enhanced by the toxin's initial effects, while his moral reasoning remained largely intact. The traps that he had positioned throughout locations of symbolic importance to Bruce Wayne's personal history represented not merely tactical advantages, but psychological insights into the predictable behavior patterns of someone who shared his memories, experiences, and fundamental approach to problem solving. The depleted uranium shells that comprised these carefully positioned weapons had been selected not for their conventional ballistic properties, but for their capacity to penetrate the exotic materials that comprised the Batman Who Laughs' protective equipment, while delivering electrical charges powerful enough to disrupt the neural pathways through which his enhanced capabilities operated. The engineering challenges involved in creating such specialized ammunition had required resources and expertise that exceeded what was normally available to private individuals. Yet Batman's connections within the scientific and military communities had provided access to materials and knowledge that made such innovations possible. Crime Alley, the Batcave, Wayne Manor, and the family cemetery represented the 4 locations where Bruce Wayne's psychological development had been most profoundly shaped, making them the most likely destinations for someone whose thought processes paralleled his own yet had been inverted through chemical corruption. The Batman Who Laughs' presence at each of these sites had triggered automated defense systems that had been designed specifically to exploit the tactical vulnerabilities that would be possessed by someone who combined Batman's knowledge with the Joker's lack of moral constraint. The electric shock that coursed through the Batman Who Laughs' body as the harpoons made contact was calibrated to disrupt the specific neural pathways that had been altered during his transformation, temporarily reverting his brain chemistry towards something approximating its original configuration. The pain that accompanied this process was both physical and psychological, as he found himself momentarily experiencing empathy, regret, and other emotions that his corruption had eliminated, creating a brief window of vulnerability that Batman was prepared to exploit. The headstone of Martha Wayne that Batman lifted and wielded as a weapon carried symbolic weight that transcended its practical value as an improvised club, representing not merely the memory of his murdered mother, but the foundational trauma that had shaped every subsequent decision in his life. The irony of using a monument to parental love as an instrument of violence was not lost on either combatant, yet the necessity of the moment transcended aesthetic considerations about appropriate methods of conflict resolution. The repeated blows that Batman delivered with his mother's memorial were driven not by hatred for his enemy, but by desperate recognition that this might represent his last opportunity to prevent the implementation of plans that would transform Gotham City into a laboratory for experiments in social control and psychological manipulation. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum neurological disruption, while the temporary window of vulnerability remained open, creating cumulative damage that might prevent the Batman Who Laughs from recovering his enhanced capabilities. The Batman Who Laughs declaration that his opponent was the worst version of their shared identity represented both tactical psychological warfare and genuine philosophical conviction, reflecting his belief that effectiveness in achieving goals was more important than adherence to moral principles that limited available options and created unnecessary complications in problem-solving processes. The accusation of being a joke was designed to undermine Batman's confidence in his methods, while also asserting the superiority of approaches that prioritized results over philosophical consistency. Batman's response that he might indeed be a joke, but was a joke who had successfully defeated his supposedly superior counterpart, demonstrated his understanding that victory often belonged not to those who were objectively strongest or most intelligent, but to those who persisted in pursuing their goals despite setbacks and apparent disadvantages. The utilization of his mother's headstone as a weapon represented the transformation of his greatest source of pain into an instrument of protection for others, the alchemical conversion of trauma into strength. The apparently fatal blow that crushed the Batman Who Laughs skull created a moment of terrible silence in the cemetery, as the participants in this cosmic drama contemplated the possibility that their conflict had finally reached its conclusion through the oldest and most definitive method available for resolving disagreements between irreconcilable opponents. Yet, even as his enemy lay motionless among the graves, Batman felt the toxin in his own system, beginning to complete the transformation that additional chemical intervention had been designed to accelerate. The Joker's arrival at this crucial moment represented the fulfillment of the promise he had made during their earlier conversation, his commitment to serving as a failsafe against Batman's complete corruption, even if such intervention required him to destroy the person he had spent decades trying to understand and defeat through less permanent means. The gunshot that he delivered was aimed not to kill, but to incapacitate, providing the shock necessary to disrupt the transformation process before it could reach irreversible completion. The aftermath of this intervention left Batman wounded but conscious, his system still contaminated with toxins that would require extensive medical treatment to neutralize completely. Yet his essential personality and moral orientation remained intact despite the chemical assault they had endured. The victory was incomplete and potentially temporary, yet it had prevented the immediate implementation of plans that would have transformed Gotham into something unrecognizable and irredeemable. In the aftermath of victory that tasted more of ashes than triumph, in those hollow hours when the immediate threat had been neutralized, yet its implications continued to echo through the corridors of consciousness, like the reverberations of a struck bell that would never fully return to silence. Batman found himself confronting the sobering reality that defeating the Batman Who Laughs had been merely the first step in a process of recovery and reconstruction that would demand resources and commitment far exceeding what had been required to achieve their tactical success in the cemetery, where his parents lay forever at rest. The melting of all remaining dark metal in Batman's possession represented more than simple disposal of dangerous materials, but rather a deliberate severing of connections to the dark multiverse and the corrupting influences that had threatened to transform Gotham's protector into its destroyer. The furnace that Alfred had constructed in the deepest levels of the Batcave burned with temperatures that exceeded those found in most industrial applications. Yet the exotic properties of the interdimensional material required such extreme conditions to break down its molecular structure and render it incapable of serving as a conduit for malevolent energies. The process of destruction was both cathartic and melancholy, as each fragment that dissolved in the intense heat represented not merely the elimination of potential weapons, but also the loss of knowledge and capabilities that might have been employed for beneficial purposes under different circumstances. The dark metal's unique properties had enabled innovations in materials science and energy manipulation that could have revolutionized legitimate applications. Yet its connection to realities where hope had been systematically eliminated made such utilization too dangerous to contemplate. Batman's supervision of this destruction while recovering from his own exposure to the toxins that had nearly completed his transformation into something unrecognizable revealed the extent to which he had been changed by the experience, not merely through chemical alteration of his brain chemistry, but through psychological confrontation with possibilities that he had never previously been forced to acknowledge. The knowledge that heroism could be corrupted so completely that the very qualities that made someone an effective protector could be transformed into instruments of oppression had fundamentally altered his understanding of his own nature and the precarious balance that separated justice from vengeance. The Hall of Justice, that monument to collective heroism, and the possibility of cooperation between beings of extraordinary capability in service of protecting ordinary people from threats that exceeded their capacity to address individually, had been selected as the most appropriate facility for containing the Batman who laughs during whatever remained of his existence. The security systems that surrounded his confinement had been designed not merely to prevent escape, but to eliminate any possibility of communication with the outside world that might enable him to continue influencing events through psychological manipulation or strategic coordination with potential allies. The cell that contained Gotham's most dangerous enemy was both marvel of engineering and philosophical statement about the nature of justice and its relationship to mercy, as it provided for his basic biological needs, while ensuring that he remained completely isolated from any stimuli that might enable him to derive satisfaction from his continued existence. The sensory deprivation that characterized his confinement was neither torture nor punishment, but rather recognition that someone whose fundamental psychology had been inverted to find pleasure in others' suffering could not be permitted any form of engagement with the world beyond his immediate physical surroundings. The ethical complexities of maintaining such a prisoner created ongoing debates among the Justice League's membership about the moral implications of indefinite confinement without possibility of trial or rehabilitation. Yet the unique nature of his condition made conventional approaches to criminal justice inadequate to address the threat he represented. His intelligence remained intact despite his corruption. His knowledge of heroic psychology and tactics could enable future threats to overcome defenses that had previously proven effective, and his very existence served as proof that the most committed champions of justice could be transformed into their opposite under sufficiently extreme circumstances. Commissioner Gordon's reunion with his son in the aftermath of their shared ordeal was characterized by cautious optimism, tempered by realistic assessment of the challenges that remained to be addressed, as both men recognized that their cooperation under extreme circumstances did not automatically resolve the fundamental psychological and legal issues that had previously complicated their relationship. James Gordon Jr.'s apparent heroism during the crisis had demonstrated genuine progress in his rehabilitation, yet the violence with which he had dispatched the grim knight suggested that his capacity for lethal action remained easily accessible when circumstances seemed to justify such responses. The medication regimen that had enabled their collaboration would require ongoing adjustment and monitoring to maintain its effectiveness while minimizing the side effects that had previously limited his quality of life and social integration. Yet the success of the treatment program offered hope that similar interventions might prove effective with other individuals whose psychological conditions made them dangerous to society. The precedent established by his conditional release and subsequent heroic actions could influence policy decisions regarding the treatment and management of criminals, whose behavior was primarily attributable to mental illness rather than moral failure. The subtle contamination that Commissioner Gordon had absorbed during his exposure to the poisoned water in the reservoir represented a delayed action threat that would require careful monitoring and potential intervention to prevent his gradual transformation into something resembling the enemies they had defeated. The toxins that had entered his system through skin contact and respiratory exposure were designed to work slowly and imperceptibly, altering personality and moral reasoning through processes that would be difficult to detect until the changes had become irreversible. The medical analysis that Alfred conducted revealed trace amounts of chemical compounds that had been specifically engineered to target the neural pathways associated with empathy and moral reasoning while leaving other cognitive functions intact, creating the possibility that Gordon might gradually lose his commitment to constitutional protections and legal procedures without losing his effectiveness as a law enforcement officer. The insidious nature of this contamination lay in its subtlety, as the changes it produced would appear to be natural evolution in response to the challenges of modern policing rather than artificial alteration imposed by external forces. The development of countermeasures to neutralize these toxins before they could achieve irreversible effects required research into biochemical processes that operated at the intersection of neurology and psychology, demanding expertise that exceeded what was available through conventional medical channels. The experimental treatments that were developed drew upon knowledge gained from Batman's own recovery process. Yet the differences in exposure levels and individual physiology meant that approaches that had proven effective in one case might not translate directly to another situation. The child, Bruce Wayne, who had been transported from his alternate reality, posed unique challenges regarding his placement and future development, as he could not be returned to his own dimension without risking exposure to whatever forces had enabled the Batman who laughs to access and manipulate interdimensional travel. His continued presence in a reality where his adult counterpart had nearly succumbed to complete moral corruption created psychological complexities that required careful management to prevent the kind of trauma that might set him on a complete path toward becoming another version of the enemy they had defeated. The foster care arrangements that were established for his protection involved individuals who had been carefully screened, not merely for their ability to provide stable and nurturing environments, but also for their understanding of the calms, unique circumstances that surrounded his situation and their commitment to maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect him from those who might seek to exploit his connection to Batman's identity. The psychological support that was provided focused on helping him process the traumatic experiences he had witnessed while preserving his essential optimism and trust in the possibility that adults could be relied upon to protect rather than exploit those dependent upon their care. The education and socialization that were planned for his development were designed to provide him with normal childhood experiences, while also preparing him for the possibility that his unique origins might eventually require him to make choices about how his abilities and knowledge could best be employed in service of protecting others. The goal was not to replicate Batman's path or prevent him from following it, but rather to ensure that whatever choices he ultimately made would be based upon healthy psychological development rather than trauma-driven compulsion. The systematic review of Gotham's infrastructure and security systems that followed the crisis revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the specific threats that had been exploited by the Batman Who Laughs and his allies, encompassing broader questions about the relationship between urban planning and public safety that had implications for cities throughout the world. The modifications that were implemented addressed not merely the technical aspects of preventing similar attacks, but also the social and economic factors that created conditions where such elaborate criminal schemes could be planned and executed without detection. The integration of new monitoring systems with existing law enforcement and emergency response protocols required careful balancing between the legitimate needs of public safety and the constitutional protections that prevented excessive surveillance and intrusion into private life. The technologies that had been developed during the crisis offered unprecedented capabilities for detecting and preventing threats before they could be implemented. Yet their deployment raised questions about the acceptable limits of government authority and the prices that could be paid in pursuit of security. The training programs that were established for police and emergency response personnel incorporated lessons learned from their encounters with enemies whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal behavior, providing them with tools and techniques that might prove effective against future threats of similar sophistication and scope. The emphasis was placed not merely on tactical responses, but on psychological preparation for confronting opponents whose actions challenged basic assumptions about human nature and moral reasoning. The research initiatives that were launched to study the long-term effects of exposure to dark multiverse energies and related exotic substances represented collaboration between scientific institutions, government agencies, and private organizations that had never previously worked together on such comprehensive scales. The data collected during the crisis provided unprecedented insights into the relationship between consciousness and reality, the malleability of moral reasoning under chemical influence, and the factors that determined whether individuals retained their essential identity when confronted with systematic attempts at psychological transformation. The philosophical implications of these discoveries extended beyond immediate practical applications to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of free will, moral responsibility, and the relationship between individual choice and environmental influence that had relevance for legal systems, educational approaches, and social policies worldwide. The evidence that personality and moral orientation could be altered through chemical intervention while leaving intelligence and memory intact challenged traditional assumptions about criminal justice and rehabilitation that would require years of careful consideration to fully address. The diplomatic efforts that were necessary to explain the crisis and its resolution to international partners and oversight organizations required delicate handling of information that could not be fully disclosed without revealing secrets that would compromise ongoing security operations. The official reports that were filed described the events in terms that emphasized conventional criminal activity and law enforcement response while omitting references to interdimensional travel, alternate realities, and other phenomena that would have strained credibility beyond acceptable limits. The economic impact of the crisis, including the destruction of Wayne Tower and the costs associated with infrastructure repairs and security upgrades, was absorbed through insurance settlements and corporate restructuring that minimized the burden on taxpayers, while demonstrating Bruce Wayne's continued commitment to protecting Gotham through both his public and private personas. The reconstruction efforts were designed to improve upon what had been destroyed, incorporating lessons learned and new technologies that would enhance the city's resilience against future threats. As the immediate aftermath of the crisis transitioned into the longer-term process of recovery and prevention, all participants found themselves changed by their experiences in ways that would continue to influence their decisions and relationships for years to come, carrying with them the knowledge that the line between heroism and its corruption was thinner than they had ever imagined, yet also the conviction that such knowledge made their commitment to protecting innocent life more rather than less important. In the aftermath of confronting his darkest reflection, and emerging victorious yet forever changed by the experience, Batman found himself compelled to engage in the kind of profound philosophical examination that rarely accompanied tactical victories, for the defeat of the Batman who laughs had resolved the immediate crisis while simultaneously revealing truths about the nature of heroism that challenged every assumption upon which he had built his life's work and identity as Gotham's protector. The questions that emerged from this cosmic conflict extended far beyond the practical concerns of preventing similar threats to encompass fundamental issues about the relationship between power and responsibility, the sources of moral authority, and the psychological mechanisms that determined whether extraordinary capability would be employed in service of creation or destruction. The Batman who laughs represented more than simply another criminal mastermind, or even another version of himself, corrupted by extraordinary circumstances, but rather the embodiment of Batman's deepest and most carefully suppressed fears about his own nature and the potential consequences of the path he had chosen in response to his parents' murder. The existence of such a creature proved that heroism was not an inevitable outcome of trauma channeled through superior intellect and physical capability, but rather one possible result among many, including outcomes so horrifying that they challenged the very concept of meaningful moral choice in a universe where identical starting conditions could produce diametrically opposed endpoints. The psychological analysis that Batman conducted in the weeks following the crisis revealed disturbing parallels between his own thought processes and those of his corrupted counterpart that suggested the differences between protector and destroyer were matters of degree rather than fundamental. Differences that could be eliminated through relatively minor alterations in brain chemistry or environmental pressure. The recognition that he possessed within himself all the intellectual tools and psychological raw materials necessary to become the Batman who laughs was simultaneously humbling and terrifying, forcing him to acknowledge that his heroism was not an expression of inherent goodness, but rather the result of conscious choices that required constant renewal and vigilance to maintain. The concept of heroism itself demanded re-examination in light of the revelation that its most essential qualities could be perverted into their opposites while remaining functionally intact, creating beings who possessed all the capabilities of traditional heroes, while employing them in service of goals that negated everything heroism claimed to represent. The Batman who laughs had retained Batman's intelligence, determination, tactical brilliance, and commitment to achieving his objectives. Yet these qualities had been redirected toward purposes that transformed protection into oppression, justice into vengeance, and hope into despair through systematic application of superior capability. The implications of this transformation extended beyond individual psychology to encompass broader questions about the nature of moral authority and the legitimacy of extraordinary individuals imposing their will upon society, regardless of their stated intentions or apparent results. If someone with Batman's capabilities could be corrupted so completely while retaining full access to his intellectual and physical resources, then what safeguards existed to prevent other heroes from following similar paths? And what mechanisms could ordinary citizens employ to protect themselves from protectors who had decided that protection required the elimination of choice, dissent, or alternative approaches to social organization? The symbiotic relationship between Batman and the Joker that had been revealed through their final collaboration in preventing Batman's complete transformation provided insights into the psychological dynamics that had sustained their conflict for decades while preventing either participant from achieving definitive victory over the other. The recognition that their opposition had evolved into a form of mutual dependence that transcended simple categories of heroism and villainy suggested that their eternal struggle served functions for both participants that went far beyond their stated goals of justice and chaos, respectively. The Joker's role as the unwitting guardian against Batman's potential corruption revealed psychological wisdom that operated below the level of conscious planning or deliberate strategy, as his instinctive understanding of what would preserve the meaning of their conflict had led him to actions that protected both their individual identities and the broader concept of moral choice that their opposition represented. His willingness to sacrifice his own life to prevent Batman's transformation into something that would make their relationship meaningless demonstrated commitment to principles that transcended his apparent dedication to chaos and chaos, destruction. The philosophical framework that emerged from analysis of their relationship suggested that good and evil were not absolute categories, but rather positions within a dynamic system that required both elements to maintain stability and meaning, that heroism derived its significance not from its opposition to abstract concepts, but from its resistance to specific manifestations of destructive impulse, and that the elimination of either component would result in the collapse of the entire moral structure that gave meaning to conscious choice and individual responsibility. Commissioner Gordon's gradual transformation under the influence of the reservoir toxins provided a case study in how moral corruption could occur through imperceptible stages that bypassed conscious resistance, while systematically undermining the psychological foundations that supported ethical behavior and constitutional restraint. The changes in his personality and decision-making processes were so subtle that they could easily be attributed to natural responses to increased job stress and social complexity rather than artificial alteration imposed by external forces, making detection and intervention extremely difficult even for trained observers. The insidious nature of this contamination lay not in its obvious effects, but in its preservation of the victim's essential personality and professional competence, while gradually eroding the moral constraints that prevented the abuse of legitimate authority for personal or ideological purposes. Gordon's continued effectiveness as a police officer made his transformation more rather than less dangerous, as his expertise and institutional position provided him with opportunities to implement changes in policy and procedure that would have far-reaching consequences for civil liberties and constitutional protections. The medical research that was conducted to understand and potentially reverse these effects revealed the sophisticated understanding of neuroscience and behavioral psychology that had been employed in designing the toxins, suggesting either collaboration with unknown scientific experts or access to research data that was not available through conventional academic or governmental sources. The precision with which the chemical compounds targeted specific neural pathways while leaving others intact indicated design principles that represented significant advances in the field of neurochemical manipulation. The child Bruce Wayne's presence in their reality served as both hope and warning about the possibilities for different developmental outcomes when identical genetic potential was exposed to different environmental influences and psychological support systems. His continued innocence and optimism in the face of traumatic experiences that might have broken other children demonstrated the resilience of human psychology when provided with appropriate care and protection, yet also highlighted the fragility of the conditions that enabled such positive development to occur and be maintained. The educational philosophy that was developed for his benefit emphasized not the prevention of trauma or difficulty, but rather the cultivation of psychological resources and social connections that would enable him to process challenging experiences in ways that promoted growth rather than damage, understanding rather than fear, and commitment to protecting others rather than seeking revenge against those who had caused harm. The goal was not to create another Batman, but to provide him with alternatives that the original Bruce Wayne had never been offered following his parents' murder. The broader implications of alternate reality contact and the possibility of systematic interference from the dark multiverse required the development of new theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual choice and cosmic influence that challenged traditional assumptions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of consciousness itself. The evidence that personality and moral orientation could be altered through exposure to energies and substances that originated from realities where different physical and psychological laws applied suggested that human nature was far more malleable than had previously been assumed. The research programs that were established to study these phenomena represented unprecedented collaboration between disciplines that had rarely interacted in meaningful ways. As physicists worked alongside psychologists, philosophers collaborated with neuroscientists, and theologians found themselves discussing empirical data about the nature of reality that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between material and spiritual existence. The discoveries that emerged from these investigations had implications for every field of human knowledge and every aspect of social organization. The question of whether consciousness was a localized phenomenon that existed within individual brains, or a universal property that could be influenced by conditions existing in parallel realities, required re-examination of basic assumptions about the nature of identity, responsibility, and the sources of moral authority that had guided legal systems and social institutions for centuries. If external forces could alter personality and moral reasoning while leaving intelligence and memory intact, then traditional approaches to criminal justice and rehabilitation would require fundamental revision to account for factors that had never previously been considered relevant. The technological innovations that had been developed during the crisis offered unprecedented capabilities for monitoring and potentially preventing various forms of psychological manipulation and chemical contamination. Yet their implementation raised serious questions about the acceptable limits of surveillance and the relationship between security and privacy that would require careful balancing of competing interests and values. The capacity to detect alterations in personality and moral reasoning could be employed for beneficial purposes of early intervention and treatment, but it could equally well serve authoritarian goals of identifying and eliminating dissent before it could organize effective resistance. The international implications of these discoveries and the need to share certain information while maintaining operational security created diplomatic challenges that required delicate negotiation between transparency and secrecy, cooperation and national interest, scientific advancement and strategic advantage. The knowledge that reality was far more complex and dangerous than had previously been understood could not be kept completely secret, yet full disclosure would create panic and potentially destabilize social institutions that depended upon public confidence in the reliability of normal experience. The economic and social disruption that would result from widespread awareness of alternate realities and the possibility of systematic psychological manipulation through exotic means could potentially cause more damage than the direct, threats that such knowledge might help prevent, creating ethical dilemmas about the appropriate balance between informed consent and social stability that had no clear resolution through existing moral and legal frameworks. The long-term monitoring systems that were established to detect potential future incursions from the dark multiverse represented significant investment in technologies and personnel that might never be needed. Yet the consequences of failing to detect such threats before they could establish themselves in stable reality were too catastrophic to accept preventable risks. The early warning networks that were created operated according to principles that pushed the boundaries of current scientific understanding while remaining grounded in empirical observation and measurable phenomena. The psychological support systems that were developed for individuals who had been exposed to dark multiverse influences, or who had witnessed events that challenged their understanding of reality, represented new approaches to trauma, counseling, and identity reconstruction that acknowledged the unique challenges posed by experiences that could not be easily integrated into normal conceptual frameworks or shared with others who lacked similar exposure to extraordinary circumstances. As Batman reflected upon the lessons that could be drawn from his confrontation with his darkest reflection, he found himself grappling with questions that had no easy answers, yet demanded responses that would shape not only his own future choices, but the broader relationship between heroism and society, between individual capability and collective welfare, between the preservation of existing order and the pursuit of necessary change. The knowledge that he carried within himself the potential for both ultimate heroism and ultimate corruption was neither paralyzing nor liberating, but rather sobering, a constant reminder that moral choice was not a single decision, but an ongoing process that required vigilance, humility, and commitment to principles that transcended immediate tactical considerations or personal desires. The victory over the Batman who laughs had been achieved not through superior force or cleverness, but through the recognition that some battles could only be won by accepting help from unexpected sources, by acknowledging limitations and vulnerabilities that had previously been denied or hidden, and by understanding that true strength lay not in independence, but in the capacity to maintain meaningful connections with others, even when such connections created additional responsibilities and potential sources of pain. And so concludes this darkest chapter in the Chronicles of the Dark Knight, where the very foundations of heroism were tested in the crucible of absolute corruption. The Batman who laughs remains imprisoned, yet his influence echoes through the shadows of Gotham, a constant reminder that the distance between protector and destroyer is measured not in power, but in choice. In facing his most twisted reflection, Batman discovered that his greatest strength lies not in his refusal to kill, but in his refusal to abandon hope even when faced with the void of absolute nihilism. Rest now, dreamer of troubled worlds, knowing that even in our darkest moments, the choice to remain human, to choose compassion over expedience, light over shadow, defines not our limitations, but our transcendence. Let the laughter fade into silence, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet courage of those who stand watch in the darkness, forever guardian against the night.